We're picking things up in Matthew 19 and verse 7 today, where Jesus is in the middle of answering a question that the Pharisees have just asked him on the topic of divorce. But before we read this, I want to go back to the verses that we looked at last week just to provide a little context that I think will help us better understand what's happening here and why Jesus responds to this question the way that he does. And so let's take a look at this section again, starting in verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Okay, so this is a scene that we've gotten pretty used to, right? Crowds of people following Jesus as he continues to minister to them, teaching them and healing them. But the difference now is the location. Matthew makes it a point here to let us know that Jesus is no longer ministering in Galilee, but that he and his disciples have now made their way to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Now, why is that significant in terms of context? Well, this is the area that was governed by King Herod, who back in chapter 14 had John the Baptist arrested and eventually killed. And why did Herod arrest John? Well, if it slipped your mind, here it is again in chapter 14 and verse 3. For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And so the reason that John the Baptist was arrested is because he was saying that it was against God's law for Herod to divorce his wife in order to marry his brother's wife. And it was that statement by John regarding what God's law has to say about divorce and remarriage that got him thrown into prison and eventually executed. So now here's Jesus in the same place that John the Baptist was when he got arrested, and wouldn't you know it, who comes along but those pesky little Pharisees again? And when they come, just to understand their mindset, we know from back in Matthew chapter 12 that these guys are conspiring together now to figure out a way to, quote, destroy Jesus. And so with that as their motivation, the Pharisees ask Jesus this question, not because they're curious, right? Not because they want to genuinely learn anything from Jesus, but in order to test him, in order to trap him. That's why it says here in verse 3 that the Pharisees came up to Jesus and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? See, they're not asking Jesus this question because they're interested in his opinion. They're trying to trick him. They're trying to get him to say something that will either get him into trouble with this huge crowd that's following him, or better yet, with Herod himself. And so they ask this question in such a way as to try and make Jesus look bad no matter how he answers it. See, because if Jesus says no, it isn't lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause, then the Pharisees can get Jesus in trouble with Herod and be like, oh, really? Okay, so you're saying the same thing that John the Baptist did. You're saying that King Herod's marriage is unlawful. Arrest this man. But if Jesus says yes, it is lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause, then they can say, oh, I see, now you're calling John the Baptist a liar. And maybe by doing that, they can get Jesus in trouble with his disciples or with the crowd. So these guys think they're pretty smart. They think they've got Jesus backed into a corner with this question. The only problem is they happen to be dealing with the Son of God. And Jesus knows exactly what they're trying to do. And so he responds to them by framing his answer in such a way that it focuses on the creation of marriage and God's original design for marriage instead of focusing on the law. And so in verse 4, Jesus answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And so Jesus takes this question that the Pharisees have asked with respect to the law and what the law has to say about divorce, and he turns it around to focus on the nature of marriage instead. because that's what's really at stake here. That's what's being eroded by the Pharisees, God's original design for marriage. See, divorce was never meant to be a part of that design. Marriage was supposed to be permanent. And that's what Jesus is emphasizing with this answer. And if you're interested in hearing more about God's perfect design for marriage, you can check out the message from last week on our YouTube channel. But this week we're focusing on the Pharisees' response to Jesus' answer, which begins right here in verse 7. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" Okay, so here's the situation. Jesus just got done saying that God's original design for marriage was a permanent union, right? What God has joined together, let not man separate. And the Pharisees' response to that was, yeah, but what about Moses? Right? Didn't Moses command that a certificate of divorce should be given to the wife and that she should be sent away? Honestly, I don't know how Jesus did it. How was he able to keep his cool in the face of such brazen, antagonistic stupidity? The Pharisees may be quoting scripture correctly, but they are totally missing the point. Moses wasn't commanding divorce. He was commanding that a certificate be given to the wife in the event of a divorce. In other words, that commandment doesn't exist to encourage divorce, but to protect the woman in the event of a divorce. See, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but the original question that the Pharisees asked back in chapter 3 was, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? See, because that's how it worked back then. A woman couldn't divorce her husband. Only the husband could divorce his wife. Now, in some cases, a woman could sometimes sue her husband and request a divorce, but even in those cases, a certificate of divorce still had to be written by the man. And so where the wife needed the consent of the man in order to get divorced, the man could do it without even consulting his wife. And some of the Pharisees believed that he could do it for any reason whatsoever, literally for any cause, even if she burned the casserole. Seriously, that was one of the schools of thought back then. Even if she spoiled a dish for him is literally what they said. And so the certificate of divorce was something that the man was required to provide in order to protect the woman from any accusations of immorality or adultery later on if she ended up marrying someone else, and also to protect her if her first husband tried to muscle in on her new marriage. And so what the Pharisees have done is they've taken a commandment by Moses that was meant to help mitigate the harmful effects of divorce and turned it into a justification for divorce. Well, Moses said that a man is allowed to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. Charming, right? And Jesus is like, yeah, well, that's because you all got hard hearts. See, divorce was relatively easy back then, just as it is today, and the Pharisees wanted to keep it that way. See, as far as the religious leaders were concerned, marriage was nothing more than a contract. That's why they cited this passage in Deuteronomy as part of the question that they posed to Jesus. See, the Pharisees come to the scriptures and ask the question, what are the rules? Right? What can I get away with? They're not interested in how their actions would affect other people. They're just looking for loopholes in the law. All they care about is the man's right to divorce his wife, and how that affects her or how that affects the children is of no consequence to them. What can I get away with? Not what's best, but what can I get away with? And see, that's ultimately why religion doesn't work. Because it sets up all of these rules and all of these laws and does nothing to address the real problem, which is the heart. See, a hard heart, according to Jesus, is what ultimately causes divorce in the first place. It was because of your hardness of heart, Jesus says in verse 8, that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And so if we really want to understand what God's true intentions are for marriage and why he regulates divorce the way that he does, then we have to go back to the beginning and look at what God designed marriage to be when he first created it, instead of focusing on what's permitted after a marriage crashes and burns. Someone once said, you don't learn how to fly a plane by studying the instructions on how to make a crash landing. And the same is true for marriage. The unfortunate measures that are put into place to mitigate the effects of a failed marriage are no help whatsoever when it comes to understanding the true meaning and intent of marriage. And that's why Jesus goes to the creation story instead of the book of the law to answer the Pharisees' question. See, the Pharisees see marriage as simply a contract between two individuals. But that is not what marriage is. Marriage is a supernatural joining together of two individuals, one male and one female, into a one flesh union. And that joining together is a work of God. It's what God has joined together, which only makes sense when you think about it, because only God is able to make 1 + 1 = 1. And so if God is responsible for creating this miraculous union between two people, then what business is it of ours to try and separate it? And that's not to say that divorce doesn't happen. Obviously, it does. Jesus doesn't say in verse 6, what God has joined together, man cannot separate, but rather, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, Jesus has a few more things to say about this, but not necessarily to the Pharisees. Like we said already, the Pharisees aren't interested in receiving any wisdom or truth or teaching from Jesus. They're just interested in trying to trap him so they can destroy him. But when it comes to Jesus' disciples, well, that's a different story. They do want to grow and learn and understand, and they genuinely want to follow Jesus and become more like him. And so after the Pharisees' lame attempt at trying to trap Jesus, Jesus then turns to his disciples and begins ministering to them because he knows that they're struggling with this. See, it's not just the Pharisees that had a very loose view of marriage and divorce and remarriage. The disciples did as well, which is why Jesus' comments surprised them. Now, in Matthew's account, it's not as obvious that Jesus turns his attention away from the Pharisees at this point. Mark in his gospel makes it a little clearer. He says in Mark chapter 10 that at this point in the story, Jesus and his disciples actually left the Pharisees and went into a house. And in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter, and that's when Jesus said, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And so Mark makes it a little clearer in his account that this next part is just between Jesus and his disciples. And I think that context is important because where before Jesus was dealing with people who were being antagonistic against him, now he's dealing with people who truly love him and want to understand. And as we've already seen in Matthew's gospel, Jesus always raises the bar when speaking to those who belong to him. Just think back to the Sermon on the Mount. He raises the bar with those who are part of his kingdom. And he raises the bar again here. Take a look at verses 9 through 12. Jesus says, and I say to you, meaning his disciples, whoever divorces his wife, and then Jesus adds here what has come to be known as the exception clause, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man and his wife, it is better not to marry. That's setting the bar pretty low, huh? But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given, which is pretty much the same thing Jesus said to his disciples back in chapter 13, where he said, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. So Jesus was making a distinction there, as he is here, between his disciples who have been given the ability to understand Jesus and everyone else, meaning the Pharisees and the crowd, who have not. Verse 12, for there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And then again, Jesus says, let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. Okay, so first off, let's just point out the obvious here. That's a lot of eunuchs. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's more eunuchs in that sentence than any sentence ever written. And so what is it that Jesus is wanting to communicate through that sentence? Well, what he's doing is he's responding to the disciples' exaggerated response of it's better not to marry at all with a little hyperbole of his own. Obviously, Jesus isn't saying that people should literally make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He's just saying that there are some, like the Apostle Paul, for instance, who have given up their right to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And so when Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees on the topic of divorce, he raises the bar with them, and he points to creation and God's original design for marriage, which didn't include divorce. And then when the disciples respond with shock and awe to the high standard that Jesus sets for regulating divorce and remarriage, even with the exception of sexual immorality, Jesus raises the bar with them even higher and points them to the kingdom of heaven. And a calling that will lead some of Jesus' disciples to even lay down their right to be married. Now, why does Jesus do this? Why does he keep raising the bar? Well, it's not to discourage us, and it's certainly not to condemn us. Jesus is addressing this topic with Pharisees who are trying to trick him, and with disciples who still have a lot to learn. There are only two instances that I'm aware of where we see Jesus address this topic with people who are actually going through it. The woman at the well who was married 5 different times, and the woman who was caught in adultery. And in both instances, Jesus addressed them with a lot of truth and with a lot of grace, which is how we should address this topic as well with one another. We don't want to compromise the truth of what God says, but we also want to make sure to apply his truth with compassion and care, making sure to address each situation individually like Jesus did, with a lot of grace. But grace does not mean watering down the truth. God hates divorce for a reason. And one of the biggest reasons is because of what marriage is supposed to represent. Paul tells us in Ephesians 5, after quoting from Genesis 1 about how a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, Paul then says, this mystery is profound. And I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. And so when Jesus sets this high bar when it comes to divorce and remarriage, it's because that's the bar he sets for himself. Jesus will never abandon his church. He will never leave us, he will never forsake us, and he will never, ever send us away. And with Jesus, there is no exception clause. Even if you're unfaithful, he will remain faithful. He will never, ever leave you. Instead, he will pursue you. You know, there's a story in the Old Testament book of Hosea that does an incredible job of illustrating God's relentless, faithful pursuit of us, even when we're repeatedly unfaithful to him. It's a story of a man who was a prophet of God, and was told by God to marry a woman who God knew would break his heart. And so the man did what God said. He married her, and sure enough, after they were married, she started to be unfaithful to him. And not just once, but many different times. Until eventually she decided to leave her husband and go off and live with one of those other men. A man who she thought loved him, or who she thought had loved her. But he was actually a slave trader. And what this man did was he tricked this woman into accumulating a significant amount of debt so that he could then make her his slave. And so, as often happened with slaves, she eventually ended up on the auction block, completely destitute, with no money and no hope of ever getting herself out of this situation and paying back this enormous debt that she owed. And so as she stands there, naked on the auction block, and people are staring at her and yelling out bids, in the midst of all of that commotion, she hears her husband's voice from the crowd. 5 shekels. Why is he doing this? 10 shekels. Well, why does he want to buy me back? Is it to punish me? 15 shekels. Sold. And for 15 shekels, the woman was bought back by her husband, the man whose heart she broke countless times. And as she sees him walking toward her through the crowd, she braces herself for what's going to happen next. But all that happens is he takes off his coat and he wraps it around his wife to cover her and to take her home. Now, as incredible as that story is, it's just a glimpse of what Jesus has done for us. Despite our past and the countless times that we have broken his heart, Jesus buys us back, not with a handful of shekels, but with hands that were pierced for our sins. This passage in Matthew 19 is often used to emphasize what is permitted and not permitted when it comes to the issues of divorce and remarriage. But what is often missed is the spirit of what Jesus is wanting to communicate to the Pharisees and even more so to his own disciples. That there is a much higher bar that we should be aspiring to. The truth is, the sin of divorce can be present in any marriage, whether a certificate has been issued or not. Someone once said that a divorce certificate is a lot like a death certificate. The paper itself doesn't cause the death. It simply certifies that a death has occurred. I think if we realize the fact that the sin of divorce can be present in a marriage before the divorce occurs, then our focus will be more on the condition of our hearts than on a piece of paper, which hopefully will cause us to be more concerned with the log that is in our own marriages before addressing the splinter we find in someone else's. The high bar that Jesus sets for marriage is meant to be a picture of the gospel, which is what God intended marriage to be from the very beginning. It's God's promise to us that he will never leave us or abandon us, but that he will always, always be faithful to us, so that we who are not always faithful can be faithfully found in him. And that loving pursuit of God should be the thing that motivates us and empowers us to raise the bar in our own marriages, whether it's your first marriage or not, and to treat it with the same kind of faithfulness and permanence that Jesus treats our relationship with him.